Moments ago, the silence of the palace was shattered. Queen Camilla, once confident in her place by King Charles's side, was left visibly shaken after discovering the late-night will King Charles had quietly designated his entire personal wealth not to her, but exclusively to Prince William. What does this mean for the monarchy, for Camilla, and for the future of the crown? The tremors have only just begun. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. It was never supposed to be her moment of reckoning. Camilla had spent years rising through the storm, solidifying her place at Charles' side, weathering the critics, the tabloids, even the shadow of Diana. But all of that confidence crumbled in an instant when a sealed document long thought to be kept under the highest protection was handed to her during a routine review of estate protocols. At first, she thought it was a legal redundancy, something already known. But as her eyes scanned the parchment, and Charles's unmistakable signature stared back at her in blue ink, the truth struck harder than betrayal. It reeked of erasure. There, in language clear and irreversible, King Charles had declared his personal wealth, his private investments, art holdings, estates beyond the crown's reach to be transferred entirely and solely to Prince William. No joint beneficiary, no provision for the Queen Consort, not even a ceremonial heirloom for her family. Sources within Clarence House confirm Camilla turned ghostly pale, her hands trembling, mouth agape, unable to find the breath to speak. A stunned gasp echoed through the chamber as the attending clerk realized the Queen had just been blindsided by the monarch's final act of private power. What made the moment even more unsettling was the legitimacy. The signature was verified. The document had been reviewed, time-stamped and recorded under royal legal protocol. Charles had gone through the correct procedures, leaving no room for questions, no wiggle room for amendments. His personal solicitor, the same man who stood beside him during the coronation rehearsals, confirmed to royal aides that the will was indeed final. It reflects the king's last known wishes with absolute clarity, he reportedly said, his voice void of sympathy. And within that legal language, one phrase burned the deepest. William was named sole steward and bearer of the king's private legacy. Not just heir to the throne, but protector of Charles's personal empire. For Camilla, this wasn't just a financial blow, it was symbolic. It was Charles declaring in ink that his trust, his legacy, and perhaps even his love had shifted elsewhere. Not to the woman who had walked beside him through scandal and public fury, but to the son who had once barely spoken to him for months at a time. Staff say Camilla didn't speak for nearly an hour. She sat, still as marble, her mind racing back to every conversation, every moment of silence, every strange glance Charles had given her over the last few weeks. What had she missed? Had this been planned all along? And if so, what did that make her an ornament to the crown, or just a placeholder until history could rewrite itself once again? She rose slowly, walked away from the study, and didn't return for the rest of the evening. But the questions she left behind would soon unravel something far darker. But how could Charles, once fiercely protective of Camilla, take such a final, cutting step behind closed doors? Long before the will emerged, whispers swirled around a mysterious meeting King Charles, William, and a trusted royal aide locked in a chamber for hours. No phones, no notes, no Camilla. What was decided behind those ancient palace walls? And why did it leave Charles more withdrawn than ever? It began with a sudden change in routine. A late evening summons, unusual for a monarch so bound by schedule, saw Prince William quietly arriving through a lesser-known palace entrance. No public acknowledgement, no official agenda, only hushed instructions delivered to select staff who were sworn to silence under threat of dismissal. The room they entered, one rarely used since the Queen's passing, had its surveillance cameras disabled moments before their arrival, a move that required internal security override, something only Charles himself could authorize. It was clear this was no ordinary meeting. The presence of a third figure, a discreet aide known to be fiercely loyal to Princess Anne, was perhaps the most puzzling. Why her? Why now? For 4 hours the three remained locked behind those double oak doors. Staff reported muffled voices, long silences, and one heated exchange that caused a nearby vase to rattle. Then nothing. Absolute quiet. When the doors finally opened, Charles looked paler than usual, eyes glassy, as if burdened by the weight of centuries. William left first, walking with a posture so straight it felt rehearsed. The aide exited last, carrying a folder tightly pressed against his chest. None of them said a word. The silence spoke louder than any proclamation. In the hours that followed, Charles retreated further into solitude, declining scheduled briefings and avoiding Camilla entirely. Servants whispered about him pacing at dawn, lips moving in quiet rehearsals of sentences no one would hear. One footman swears he overheard the king whisper, "This must be my final act of clarity," as he stood motionless by the window, staring toward the gates of Windsor. An eerie chill passed through the palace that night, not of winter, but of finality. Royal historians, usually skeptical of rumour, began to murmur. The secrecy, the symbolic location, the exclusion of Camilla, this bore the markings of royal transition, a hallmark seen in past centuries when power shifted not through speeches, but through silence. It wasn't just an inheritance being planned, it was a legacy being sealed. The timing was precise, weeks before the will's timestamp, yet perfectly aligned with a sudden uptick in legal visits, revised security briefings, and private conversations between Charles and Catherine. Because yes, Catherine knew. Sources confirmed she was informed that very evening, told to prepare for a change. But Camilla? She remained in the dark, going about her royal duties as if her future hadn't already been signed, away. There was no confrontation, no warning, just a slow withdrawal of warmth from Charles, a creeping sense that her voice was no longer needed in decisions that mattered. What was said in that chamber remains one of the most tightly kept secrets in recent royal history, but what it triggered is undeniable. That was the night King Charles stopped seeing Camilla as his partner and began shaping a kingdom without her. As the ink dried on the will, another story unfolded, a story of a fractured marriage and buried resentments that go far deeper than the public ever imagined. Behind every regal smile, Camilla has been fighting a quiet war. Once hailed as queen consort, she now walks palace halls filled with whispers, unanswered glances, and locked doors. This wasn't just a sudden betrayal, it was the culmination of a slow, silent sidelining she never saw coming. It began with subtle exclusions, the kind that could be brushed off until they couldn't. Strategic family meetings, the ones that shaped royal policy and dictated ceremonial presence, started happening without her. She'd hear of them after the fact, sometimes from a passing staffer, sometimes from the pre-SS. When she confronted Charles about it, he simply said they were informal. But informality had never been a barrier before, and now, it seemed, it was the new boundary line drawn around her. That line thickened when her long-trusted private secretary, a woman who had served her for years, was quietly downgraded. No announcement, no reason, just a reassignment that pushed her into irrelevance. In her place came an unfamiliar face, one who answered to William's aides, not hers. The pattern became impossible to ignore. One by one, her ceremonial duties were reallocated, passed on not to lesser royals, but to Catherine. Engagements Camilla had prepared for were suddenly reassigned, her name removed from briefing documents. It wasn't just oversight, it was orchestration. And soon, even the air in the palace began to shift. Courtiers who once bowed with warmth now gave her cool, mechanical greetings. Her personal requests were delayed. Orders went unacknowledged. When she questioned her dwindling influence, she received rehearsed assurances, yet nothing changed. In fact, things grew worse. One of the most jarring moments came when her security detail, those guards she had grown to trust, were reassigned overnight. No explanation, no protocol. When she demanded answers, she was met with vague remarks about realignments and resource efficiency. But she knew better. These weren't logistics, these were signals. She no longer held the authority to protect even herself, let alone her place within the monarchy. The final blow came when she learned several of her most loyal courtiers had been quietly let go. In their place stood men and women who answered directly to William's team, staff who barely looked at her, yet walked freely through her corridors. Camilla was no stranger to judgment. She had endured decades of public scrutiny. But this was different. This was an invisible hand turning every doorknob against her, locking her out of a kingdom she thought she had finally become part of. She confided in one aide, whispering through gritted teeth, "I feel like a ghost in my own household." And that's exactly what she had become. Not banished with fury, but erased with precision. But the emotional unraveling wasn't the only piece of the puzzle. What Charles wrote in his private journal revealed a side of the king the world never expected. Buried inside King Charles's private study, hidden beneath decades of correspondences, was a journal entry so personal, so raw, it sent chills down the spine of those who read it. "I owe William the future. I owe Camilla nothing more than gratitude." What drove the king to immortalize such chilling final words? It wasn't found by accident. After the will surfaced, palace aides began carefully cataloguing Charles's personal belongings, ensuring that his legacy, both public and private, was recorded. Deep inside the oak-panelled desk he had used since his days as Prince of Wales, a leather-bound journal rested beneath old correspondence from his mother. Inside, a single entry dated exactly 48 hours after a particularly explosive argument between Charles and Camilla revealed the emotional aftermath of that confrontation. The writing was deliberate, the ink slightly smudged, suggesting hesitation between lines, but its message was undeniable. In the opening lines, Charles admitted a burden he had long kept hid. A guilt that had never left him. "My duty to Diana was never fulfilled," he wrote, "and my silence was my greatest betrayal." For a man who had spent decades trying to move past the shadow of his first wife, these words were more than reflection, they were confession. The entry then pivoted to William. Charles described his son as the rightful heir not just to the throne, but to the legacy I failed to protect. He referenced public sentiment, the monarchy's fragile trust, and the mounting pressure to secure the next generation's reign without question or controversy. And then came the most damning line, a paragraph that made it clear this decision had been simmering beneath the surface for years. "Camilla's loyalty cannot be denied," Charles wrote, "but neither can the cost of her presence." He continued, "Her family, while kind, represent a chapter of comfort, not of continuity. They are not born of the crown. They cannot carry it forward. They distract. They dilute." The words were painful, calculated, and above all, irreversible. What followed was perhaps the only sign of hesitation. Charles admitted his deep affection for Camilla. He praised her strength during the most turbulent years of his life, her steadiness, her laughter. But the contrast was stark. That affection, he noted, did not equate to legacy, not when the nation watched his every move, not when history still whispered Diana's name louder than Camilla's, not when the eyes of the world were already turning to William and Catherine as the faces of the future. The final line of the entry said it all, just 7 words that struck like a final gavel. Let the legacy pass untainted to him. There were no natures, no dramatic flourish, just a cold, quiet ending that closed the chapter with the weight of monarchy behind it. A line that not only justified the will but damned any hope Camilla had of reversing it. The echoes of Diana's memory may have shaped the will, but the future of the monarchy now teeters on how Camilla chooses to respond. They said it was the loudest shouting match ever heard inside Clarence House. Camilla, her voice cracking with betrayal, stormed into William's private chamber demanding answers. But what she got was colder than silence. She got resolve. What William told her would end any doubt about who now rules. There was no warning, no request for audience, no knock at the door. Camilla burst into the room, flanked by no one, her eyes red with fury and confusion. Inside, William stood at the center of the room with 2 of his most trusted aides, reviewing briefing papers that were rumored to include transition plans for upcoming royal restructuring. Without even waiting for acknowledgement, Camilla slammed the door behind her and demanded that the will be amended, that Charles's final act be reversed before it became law. The room froze. William didn't move. He simply placed the documents down, straightened his back, and looked directly at her. What followed wasn't a negotiation, it was a reckoning. Her voice, usually measured and restrained, had risen into near hysteria. "You don't understand what this does to me," she reportedly shouted. "He promised me forever. This is theft. This is betrayal." But William remained unnervingly calm. His words cut deeper than any shout ever could. According to a senior aide positioned outside the room, his voice was firm but final when he said, "This isn't about you anymore. It never was." The weight of that sentence silenced her for a beat. Her face, witnesses say, contorted from rage to disbelief, as it sunk in. William wasn't going to bend. He wasn't going to compromise. The decision had been made long before Charles took his final breath, but that wasn't all. William then delivered a blow she hadn't expected. He warned her that more documents were being prepared, ones that would make the current transition irreversible. The implication was chilling. The will was only the beginning. Legal restructuring, estate transfers, ceremonial authority, all of it was moving swiftly, and Camilla was being left behind at every turn. And she knew then this wasn't about grief. This was about power, and she was now on the outside of it. Tears welled in her eyes, but not from sorrow, from fury. She accused him of orchestrating this coup from within, of manipulating Charles in his final months. She demanded to know what Catherine knew, and when. But William didn't entertain the accusations. He simply turned back to his aides and resumed the conversation as though she had never entered the room. That dismissal broke something in her. As she exited, guards nearby heard her muttering through clenched teeth, "He promised me forever," over and over, like a spell she couldn't break. But the war wasn't over. Camilla's next move wasn't confrontation, it was investigation, and what she found only deepened the betrayal. Follow the money, and you'll find the truth. That's exactly what Camilla did, and what she uncovered revealed that Charles's decision wasn't just emotional. It was financial warfare. Accounts close. Properties reassigned. Everything already moved into William's control before Camilla even knew the battle had begun. What started as a desperate attempt to understand turned into a slow-motion avalanche of discovery. After her confrontation with William, Camilla didn't retreat. She activated her own team of legal advisors and financial contacts, some loyal to her since her earliest days at court. She demanded full access to Charles's personal holdings, assuming that her name would be attached to at least a portion of them. But instead of clarity, she was met with locked files, sealed transitions, and a trail of decisions that had already been executed without her knowledge. Balmoral and Highgrove, two of the king's most symbolic personal estates, had their financial trusts quietly transferred to William months before Charles's health began to publicly decline. There were no joint oversight clauses, no shared custodianship, just clean, clinical reassignments. Her inquiries only grew darker. Swiss banking contacts revealed that several accounts historically linked to the Duchy of Cornwall's private income had been rerouted in early spring, well before the royal household began whispering about Charles's condition. The recipient? William, not just as heir to the duchy but as sole beneficiary. Camilla's name, which she had assumed would appear by virtue of marital alignment, was nowhere to be found. But the most crushing blow came when she was handed documentation tied to a vault in Bermuda, one previously known only to Charles and his most trusted advisors. Within it sat rare jewels, confidential family deeds, and private letters spanning generations. The vault, according to records, now listed Prince William and Prince George as the exclusive successors. Still reeling, Camilla demanded to see the joint trust's financial vehicles she had believed she and Charles had co-owned, but again her presence was erased. Somehow, over the course of a year, clauses had been amended, her legal footprint scrubbed clean, her access quietly nullified, and while William's legal team made no public moves, insiders confirmed they had already begun the process of consolidating Charles's private philanthropic entities, absorbing charitable assets under the new royal foundation structure. It was a takeover, quiet, calculated, and absolute. But what disturbed her most wasn't the paper trail, it was the silence. Charles's longtime personal accountant, a man who had dined at her table and sent her holiday cards for 15 years, refused to respond to her requests. No explanation, no return call, just a message relayed through a legal intermediary: everything is in accordance with the king's wishes. It was that phrase, the king's wishes, that echoed in her mind as the truth settled in. Charles hadn't forgotten her, he had removed her. Yet amidst the cold calculations, Camilla's emotional spiral reached a point of no return, and the royal family began to fracture in ways no one could control. As Camilla's influence crumbled, One figure stood taller than ever, Princess Catherine. With grace and quiet strength, she stepped into roles once reserved for Camilla. But behind her serene smile lies a truth that few are willing to say out loud. Catherine's rise was no accident. It began quietly, almost respectfully. A shift in responsibilities here, a ceremonial adjustment there. But within months, the patterns grew impossible to ignore. Catherine was no longer simply a supporting royal. She had become the de facto face of the monarchy. Where Camilla once received daily policy briefings and handled sensitive correspondence, those updates now went directly to Catherine. When international dignitaries inquired about future appearances, they were told to coordinate around the Princess of Wales's schedule. The Queen Consort was no longer the axis of royal activity. The palace had recalibrated, and its new centre was unmistakable. Charles's inner circle, those lifelong advisers who had served the monarchy through scandal and triumph, began using a new title in private, Her Future Majesty, not spoken out of protocol but out of conviction. It wasn't just about lineage, it was about leadership. Catherine had become the stabilizing force within the firm, the one who never wavered, never scandalized, never cracked. And as Camilla floundered, alienated and disoriented, Catherine simply stood still and let the weight of the crown shift onto her shoulders. One moment in particular captured the sentiment of the inner family. A leaked message from Princess Anne, never one to mince words, stated bluntly, "She is the one Diana would have chosen." It was more than approval. It was an endorsement of succession. And it hit Camilla like a dagger. The late Princess of Wales still haunted every hallway of Buckingham Palace, but now her memory was rising through her daughter-in-law. Catherine didn't fight for the crown, she inherited it by embodying what the crown needed to survive: restraint, resolve, and public adoration. Even Charles, once seen as unwavering in his devotion to Camilla, had grown noticeably closer to Catherine. Over the past year their relationship had deepened through private meetings, shared briefings, and mutual admiration for the structure she brought to royal operations. He began calling on her more often, deferring to her counsel on issues ranging from diplomatic relations to internal staffing. It was a subtle but seismic shift. Camilla was no longer the king's sounding board. Catherine was, Camilla noticed, and she didn't stay silent. In private, she accused Catherine of orchestrating a palace freeze out of surrounding herself with key players, charming Charles's allies, and quietly drawing the spotlight away. But the accusation fell flat. Catherine didn't need to orchestrate anything. The institution itself was turning toward her, as if pulled by an invisible force that neither Camilla nor anyone else could stop. She had become the embodiment of continuity, and the crown, hungry for stability, had chosen. But if Catherine is the future, and Charles made William the heir to his personal crown, what does that make Camilla now? Just when it seemed it couldn't get worse, it did. In the annex of Charles's will was a sealed addendum. Camilla's children and grandchildren were to receive nothing. Not a tlay, not a coin. The woman once welcomed into the monarchy now faced a complete erasure of her bloodline from royal legacy. The document was brief but devastating. A second envelope, marked with the king's personal seal, was opened in the presence of the family's most senior legal advisers. What lay within was not just clarification, it was obliteration. Camilla's son, Tom Parker Bowles, and daughter, Laura Lopes, were both named explicitly not for recognition but for exclusion. No inheritance, entitlement, or affiliation to be granted, sustained, or symbolically extended to descendants by marriage, the clause read. Cold, precise, final. There was no ambiguity. The children she had brought into Charles's world had been erased from it in a single stroke of the pen. Within 24 hours of the will being finalized, their privileges began disappearing. Travel arrangements once made automatically were abruptly cancelled. Security clearances for royal properties were revoked without notice. Aides quietly began removing their names from palace visitor registries. Camilla, still reeling from the emotional assault of being written out of the legacy herself, now watched in horror as her children were dismantled from the institution they had cautiously grown close to. They weren't just being left out, they were being unacknowledged. But it didn't stop there. A particularly harsh clause stated that lifetime access to royal residences, previously granted in private agreement during Charles and Camilla's union, was now officially rescinded for her descendants. No more weekends at Sandringham, no more quiet getaways at Birkhall. Nothing. The monarchy wasn't just cutting ties, it was sealing the exits behind them. The cruelty of it became even clearer when the list of newly honoured royals surfaced. Zara Tyndall and Lady Louise, both grandchildren of Queen Elizabeth, were granted extended ceremonial honours, with their children being included in early plans for future engagements. The implication was brutal. The bloodline mattered. Legacy mattered. And in the cold ledger of monarchy, Camilla's family simply didn't qualify. Sources say Camilla's advisors urged her to contest the annex. There were legal avenues, precedents, even technicalities they could exploit. But she refused. Not because she agreed, but because something inside her had broken. She sat in silence after reading the document, her hands shaking, her eyes locked on the final sentence written by Charles himself. The crown must remain undiluted. That one phrase erased everything the love they had fought for, the decades of devotion, the battles she had won just to stand beside him. Now it all meant nothing. He hadn't just chosen William. He had dismantled her legacy to do it. But what came next wasn't silence. It was Charles's final words to the world, words no one was supposed to hear. A single audio file, accidentally recorded on a secure palace line, has now gone viral. It captures King Charles speaking to his private confidant just weeks before the will. In it, he confesses a truth that leaves no doubt about his intentions and no room for Camilla in the future he envisioned. It wasn't meant to be heard. The line, typically used for confidential correspondence between the monarch and senior advisors, had been unknowingly patched into a recording system under audit. The file sat undissed, herbed in a digital vault, until a low-level technician flagged the flagged metadata, Monarch Priority, Classified 7. What he unearthed was not protocol. It was confession. In a hushed voice, cracked with exhaustion but unmistakably resolute, King Charles spoke not like a ruler, but like a man finally unburdening himself of the truth. "My legacy must heal the past, not repeat it," he began. The words were soft, deliberate, but their weight hit like thunder. In a single sentence, he acknowledged the wounds he had spent decades trying to cover, wounds from a broken marriage, a national tragedy, and a fractured public trust. He didn't name her, but he didn't have to. Diana was everywhere in his voice. He spoke of the people's unshakable love for her, of the way her image had been burned into the collective conscience of the nation. "They never let her go," he said, "and truthfully, neither did I." Then came the shift. The quiet reverence turned to quiet conviction. He spoke of William not just as a son, but as something larger. "He is the son of a nation, not just of mine," Charles said, his voice tinged with something between pride and penance. "He carries what I never could, clean hands, a clean heart, an unbroken bond with the people." The statement wasn't just praise, it was a surrender, a father handing over more than a crown, handing over the very narrative of the monarchy. But it was his words about Camilla that sent shockwaves through the palace walls. He described her presence as comforting, stabilizing, but she was never meant to shape the monarchy, he admitted, not because she wasn't capable, but because she wasn't called. He paused, as if the weight of what he was about to say needed permission to be spoken. The monarchy doesn't need comfort now. It needs clarity. In that moment, all doubts vanished. This wasn't a reactionary will. This was a decision born out of guilt, foresight, and a desire to rewrite what had gone so horribly wrong decades before. Then, as if knowing the line might one day be heard beyond the intended ear, Charles closed with words so haunting. They've echoed across headlines and hushed rooms alike. "George, Charlotte, Louis, they are the crown's compass now. I only hope history forgives me. Forgive me, but this is how it ends." The line went silent. No further breath. No explanation, just a man, once broken by scandal, choosing to end his reign with a single irreversible act of reparation. And so it ends not with ceremony, but with silence, sacrifice, and a signature that rewrote the future of the monarchy forever. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.